Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're setting off on a fascinating journey right into the heart of Central Asia. We're exploring the rich and, well, incredibly layered history of Uzbekistan.
Exactly. And we're doing it by pulling from, a stack of detailed sources, articles, research, historical texts. Our goal is to really unpack this history, not just list facts, but extract the most important nuggets, the surprising insights.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut, maybe, to being well-informed about this really ancient and strategically vital land.
Precisely. So picture a place.
Yeah.
A place that's seen human settlement for millennia. A true crossroads of empires and cultures, where ancient traditions haven't just disappeared, they persist right alongside modern life.
That's the essence of Uzbekistan we're going to dive into.
Let's start with the modern picture, maybe, and then we can peel back the layers of time. Today, Uzbekistan is an independent state, gained that sovereignty on September 1st, 1991.
Right. And it sits right in the middle of Central Asia, covering about, 447,400 square kilometers. Now, our sources actually give a few different figures for the population, ranging from around 25 or 26 million up to about 32 million people.
So yeah, it's a large country, whichever number you land on, and you can still feel the echoes of its deep trading past everywhere you go, really.
Yeah.
Classic greeting salam, you hear it in bustling bazaars, in banks, even in hotels. It's like a thread running through the culture.
And speaking of culture, our sources highlight the value placed on antiquities and these things called serafa.
Yes, ranking second only to jewels, apparently.
Wow.
And you see this in things like the generation pendants. They're crafted from ceramic gold or blown glass. People still make them and wear them today, carrying that history forward, though unfortunately some have slipped onto the black market.
Shame. Looking at the broad strokes of its past rulers, this land was under the sway of massive figures like Genghis Khan and Timurid.
Tamerlane.
Yeah, often known as Tamerlane, then part of the Turco-Persian Empire, before Russia conquered it in the mid-19th century. And eventually, it was incorporated into the USSR as the Uzbek Republic in 1924.
And independence wasn't a quiet affair. According to one source, M. Dusenberry, it was hard-won. Uzbeks were among the earliest Soviet peoples to revolt, actually, back in 1918, 1919.
Facing a pretty brutal regime by the 1930s, the sources say.
Yeah.
The Soviet era had a significant and in some ways really devastating impact. After World War II, Uzbekistan became the main supplier of cotton for the Soviet Union, a focus that famously contributed to the environmental disaster of the Aral Sea.
Right, the Aral Sea disaster, a huge consequence. And while Uzbekistan might not be known for, say, dramatic mountains or coastlines, its cities are. Well, they're truly spectacular. The sources really emphasize the sheer wealth of ancient urban centers here.
Oh, absolutely. Samarkand immediately comes to mind. It's Registan Square. It's described as one of the world's grandest urban spaces, just visually stunning.
Totally. And within Samarkand, the Shahyazinde necropolis is called the Jewel of the City. It's incredibly visually exciting. One of the largest and earliest surviving collections of monumental tombs in the entire Islamic world. Famous for those vivid blue mosaics.
It's incredible imagery. Then there's Bukhara, another key city, once Tamerlane's capital. It's a dense, complex place, isn't it? A series of mosques and bazaars with delightful hidden details and nooks.
It really is. Bukhara's Ark Citadel still stands, remarkably complete, even including what was once the harem. And the restored Kalyan Mosque and its towering minaret. They're ranked among the world's finest monuments.
And we shouldn't forget other places like Khiva and Termez. They're mentioned as extraordinary gems in their own right, each with their own deep history.
Now let's go back even further, peeling back those layers. The territory of modern Uzbekistan. It has incredibly deep roots. Settled by early hominids astonishingly long ago, the late Paleolithic, maybe 150,000 to 100,000 years before now.
Wow. Yeah. They evolved in caves and open-air sites, particularly in the eastern and southern parts of the region, leaving behind ancient tools and weapons that tell us something about their presence.
Yeah, and this region really became a heartland, a place where various ancient civilizations flourished and, crucially, passed on their achievements through Central Asia.
One of the oldest centers of ancient farming mentioned is the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. This was a Bronze Age urban culture from the early 3rd millennium BC that actually stretched all the way from Iran through Central Asia right into what is now Uzbekistan.
Sources also highlight other ancient states and civilizations here, like the Fergana Valley, that carried on agricultural traditions after that Bactrian culture declined. And the state of Sogdiana covered the valley and nearby areas.
Right.
Alongside other important centers like Transoxiana, Khwarezm, Bukhara, and Samarkand.
It seems like early governance in places like Sogdiana, Khwarezm, and the Fergana Valley involved using fixed locations, kind of like centers for control and management.
Exactly. Almost like anchor points in a network, particularly for managing larger geographical units. Collective control techniques, the sources call it.
Okay.
And a really significant site is Sarazm, located right where Transoxiana and Khwarezm meet. Researchers have found extensive evidence there from the Middle Holocene era. It indicates a surprisingly sophisticated culture of urban life, resource management,
Even back then.
even back then, and trade that ensured supplies, like raw materials, could cross the desert.
Incredible.
It's recognized as a UNESCO Millennium World Cultural Heritage Site now. This area was just so ethnically dynamic, evolving from more nomadic structures towards fully urban empires over time.
And you see early tribes domesticating oxen and sheep mentioned as far back as the 1st centuries AD. Greek sources also talked about regions like Sogdiana, Margiana, Bactria, Khwarezm, and Fergana. Figures like Aristotle even referencing groups like the Scythians, Daha, and Sogdians.
Yeah. And because much of this region is desert, historical populations were, well, smaller and clustered around vital rivers and lakes. This led to early nomadic tribes, and then later, as agriculture became possible in those riverine areas, you get more settled tribes and urban cultures emerging.
Although the sources do note that detailed information on that specific shift, from nomadic to sedentary life, is still a bit scant.
True. Archaeology is providing some clues, but there's not enough yet to write a complete, standalone history of Uzbekistan just from that really early evidence alone.
But what's clear is that being a landlocked region right at the crossroads, Uzbekistan's early history and development are deeply intertwined and shared with its neighbors across Central Asia. It didn't happen in isolation.
Absolutely not. Which leads us perfectly into the Silk Road.
Here's where things really take off, isn't it? The rise of the Silk Road. This wasn't just a trade route. It marked the beginning of what we might, call globalization. It was this massive network communication, trade exchange that profoundly shaped the social and political development of the ancient world.
It really did. And by the turn of the second millennium AD, that intense commercial activity connecting East and West spurred interaction between distant civilizations. And it really fueled the growth of these extensive urban centers right across Central Asia.
Historical accounts confirm a network of roads existed, with commercial cities being revived and thriving under dynasties like the Samanids and Karakhanids.
Interestingly, some sources point out that traditional studies haven't always focused enough on the spatial and environmental aspects of the Silk Road, but new excavations are showing that urban centers in river oases weren't only relying on heavy goods brought by camel caravans.
Oh, okay. So there were other factors, local production, maybe different transport.
Exactly. It suggests there were other ways things were moved or produced locally, adding complexity to the whole trade picture.
Bukhara, in particular, really blossomed during this Silk Road golden age, didn't it? Especially between the 4th and 6th centuries AD. It even served as the Samanid capital for over a century, from 893 to 999 AD, developing that remarkable architecture and urban layout we still see traces of.
And it remained prosperous right up until the Mongol invasion in 1220. It was clearly one of the largest and most important urban centers of that whole era. Still a key city today, of course.
Yeah.
And these new findings, especially from Sogdiana, they just reinforced that the region was absolutely central to this complex network of trade, politics, and culture as the Silk Road emerged and developed.
Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the impact of a major empire, the Persian Empire. Its conquest had a huge influence on Central Asia and Transoxiana.
Yeah, the Achaemenid dynasty established this vast empire way back in the 7th century BC. And at its peak, mid-5th century BC, it stretched all the way from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. Just enormous.
But it eventually declined in the 4th century BC, weakened by internal issues, and of course conquered by Alexander the Great.
Right, and the eastern parts saw the arrival of Turks later on, leading to a decline in some of the old Achaemenid cities. But the legacy of Persian leaders and their exploits lived on in epic poems, and their capitals definitely show influence from Greek culture after Alexander's conquest.
The Persian conquest itself fundamentally transformed the region. I mean, it had a dramatic effect on the economic structure, political organization, and the culture. Central Asia wasn't just on the periphery anymore. It became a crucial link in this massive economic system connecting the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Central Asia itself, India, and the Far East.
Absolutely. And this period saw the birth and growth of those wondrous Central Asian cities we talked about, like Samarkand and Bukhara. And caravan trade just exploded.
The construction of a major road network, including one stretching 2,500 kilometers from Bactria to Western Asia, really signaled the expansion of international commerce. Persian settlement and the wealth of eastern states definitely spurred on this kind of long-distance trade.
On one source uses a wonderful phrase. It says that the heady excitement of this extensive trade enterprise made Transoxiana feel something of a second Greece.
That's evocative, a place of great energy and exchange. Our sources also briefly touch on the famous Persian Wars, the ones between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire from 492 to 449 BCE. While they were fought over in the Aegean, they're incredibly significant culturally, right? Shaping Greek identity and mythology.
Definitely. They stem from ongoing conflicts, with Darius's first expansion clashing with the independent Greek city-states. Grievances and the Ionian revolts really escalated the situation.
And the early Persian campaigns were costly for them, leading to key defeats like the Battle of Salamis.
Right, which ultimately weakened Persian control and led to a period of peace, relatively speaking.
Okay, let's shift focus now to something quite different but equally fascinating. A remarkable cultural expression. The 19th century ikat textiles.
Yes, ikat, described as the most magnificent icon of Uzbekistan from that period.
You see these splendid, richly patterned fabrics, often brocade or velvet ikat, used in the flowing robes worn by wealthy merchants and khans in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand.
The opulence of these textiles really rivaled luxurious velvets. They were statements.
And the sources point out that the ikat costumes and textiles from this period are unusually well documented compared to other historical clothing.
With impressive collections in museums that have been studied extensively since the 1970s.
And importantly, these textiles weren't confined just to the major oasis cities, were they?
No, they were dispersed in varying quality and quantity across a wide geographical and cultural area of Central Asia.
Documentary evidence suggests a relatively sudden and really spectacular rise in the popularity and production of these textiles, starting from their earliest known use in the mid-18th century.
Yeah, it seems to have really taken off.
The 19th century pieces are particularly evocative, representing a time when the silk warp ikat and velvet ikat robes worn in the Khanate courts were considered the absolute peak, the apogee of Central Asian textile art.
These were often made from a specific fabric called atlas, an intricate ikat with ornate wefts and velvet pile, woven with incredible skill.
They were clearly luxury items, considered precious and valuable, described in one source as like flowers filled with honey.
Lovely phrase. And the elite patrons consciously commissioned these textiles to create robes for formal occasions, emphasizing status and ceremony.
While museums hold vast collections today, it's noted that very few examples are found in situ, in ordinary homes from that period.
Right. In wealthier households, textiles were often altered or damaged by decay or just kept hidden away.
And beyond their beauty, the structure and patterns of ikat textiles held meaning, didn't they? Conveying messages of fertility, splendor, wealth.
Yes. The bright colors and complex designs weren't just decorative. They were intended to establish visual rules of proper vision, likely associated with social status and how one should be perceived.
And there's been a modern revival of these textile traditions, particularly ikat weaving, focusing on semi-nomadic groups in the region.
Yeah, it's great to see that happening.
These contemporary pieces, often knitted from white silk yarn, feature ingenious and dazzling designs that blend complex geometric motifs. These weighty, intricate designs on costly fabrics could be, 1,000 times more expensive than simple cotton.
Easily. They're works of art.
You see ikat designs in women's attire today: skirts, shawls, scarves, hats. Many people, including children, still wear ikat shawls in daily life, whether going to school, work, the bazaar, or just outside the city walls.
And in the more rural areas, ikat weaving remains a picturesque part of village life. It reflects the people's beliefs, their status, traditions, tastes. Specific designs, like matla on shawls, have specific meanings.
For instance, in winter, stylized snowflakes were woven, tied to the superstitious belief that they could bring wealth. A design called peshkodam, representing a blooming willow, was worn by young brides for good luck, symbolizing life.
Right. And for old age, Timurid designs on the back were meant to sort of move wealth and good fortune away. Interesting belief.
Yeah.
This tradition truly flourished across the region, driven by inventive design, wealthy patrons, and extensive connections between different areas. Each Central Asian society developed its own unique style, resulting in just an extraordinary variety of ikat textiles.
Okay, now let's turn to what one source calls an epoch-making change. the arrival and adoption of Islam. This shift from Zoroastrianism was hugely important, wasn't it? Not just for history, but for the region's cultural identity, forming the basis for the small medieval Uzbek states that would emerge later.
Absolutely fundamental. Arab military expeditions began relatively early, in 651 AD, shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. These operations played a key role, leading eventually to the capture of Samarkand.
However, sources emphasize that Arab rule wasn't imposed suddenly or completely everywhere.
No, not at all. Some territories resisted, and there were ongoing struggles with local rulers, and difficulty conquering these fortified structures, sins they were called, beyond the main towns and trade routes.
What's described as shocking, though, is how widely Islam was accepted by the 9th and 10th centuries. Despite being quite different from the existing local norms and ethnic traditions, people embraced Islam, made it their own, and really localized its practice.
It is quite remarkable, and as Islam spread, Arabic and Iranian became the languages of religious and literary writing, learned almost like native languages by the educated elite. These remained the major literary languages for Muslims in the region, known as Turkestan, right up until the 20th century.
And this new literature and culture weren't created in a vacuum, were they? They incorporated the rich ethnic heritage built up over, well, 2 to 3 millennia in the region.
Exactly. It was a synthesis. And this period is seen as a golden renaissance of Muslim culture. Literature and scholarly works in Arabic and Persian were incredibly rich and diverse. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Shariabs, and Tashkent grew beyond just local importance.
They influenced surrounding countries, seen as equals and friendly neighbors to major centers like Baghdad and Nishapur.
The cultural achievements were vast, collecting books, assembling manuscripts, extensive writing and translation, and magnificent construction projects for education, religion, civic life.
And scholars and poets held high status, sometimes even equalized with kings.
Yeah. This era in Bukhara and Samarkand is truly part of the golden age of Muslim art, science, and culture.
Interestingly, Islam didn't only arrive through conquest. Before the Arab military campaigns, it had already started entering the territory through diplomatic and commercial ties.
That's a crucial point. Trade caravans and ambassadorial journeys acted as bridges for the new faith. Those who accepted Islam peacefully were referred to as Sabi.
In fact, some sources credit peace-loving Muslims who followed principles of love and peace rather than hostility for Islam's spread through trade and scholarly networks along those key caravan routes to cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva.
And many early believers included notable Iranian poets and scientists.
So over time, numerous Muslim communities grew across the territory. Cities like Herat, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Termez became major centers for Muslim history and culture.
Yes, Islam's establishment really went hand in hand with the flourishing of science, literature, and culture, with Samarkand particularly noted as a center for learning.
And generous charitable donations from Arab governors funded the construction of mosques, madrasas, schools, and libraries. Historical figures acted as patrons for poets and scholars, fostering intellectual advancement.
And eventually, Islam became the state religion in the region, marking the official beginning of Muslim science and literature here.
Now, while propagation was vigorous, the sources also mention the appearance of various Islamic groups, sects, and cults. Some considered apostates or deviant who branched off and were sometimes led by influential figures.
Right. While some pre-conquest sects met privately, this trend became more pronounced and sometimes harsher after the Arabo-Muslim Empire conquered Khwarezm.
Our sources also briefly touch on how this deep historical background, including the arrival of Islam and its social structures, influenced contemporary society and culture, specifically mentioning the roles of women and the state of crafts.
Women are described as having a foundational role in defining family, culture, and society across generations, with traditional responsibilities centered around the home or yurt.
Today, times are changing, of course, with more young women pursuing higher education. However, the tradition persists for some older generations where women perhaps wait for men returning from public life.
Yeah, men tend to dominate the public sphere, with women's public presence noted primarily in things like peaceful protests.
And Uzbek crafts, of course, remain well known. Traditionally, certain crafts were men's work, while women focused on household items.
The women's crafts have recently gained commercial popularity, haven't they?
They have. And despite modernization, crafts are still widely popular.
Yeah, rather than seeing traditional crafts as simply being lost, some analysis suggests they are evolving, much like crafts and industries have changed globally over the past century. It's not static.
A good point. Now let's turn to what one source highlights as perhaps the single most important and tragic event in Uzbekistan's history. The Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan. Its impact is described as changing world history.
A profound statement, but likely accurate for the region. After unifying the Mongol tribes, Genghis Khan focused his attention on the sinking territory, inhabited by Turkic and Uyghur peoples. It was a vast, difficult area, so he planned strategically, reportedly attacking village by village.
This region, described as tired and weak, was completely crushed. Genghis Khan then turned towards China. At one point, the Oghuz Turks, who ruled other Turkic regions, allied with the Chinese army and planned to attack Mongolia. But this plan failed badly.
Right, and they fled west to Khwarezm for survival.
The Khwarezmian Shah's armies were then defeated by the Mongols. The sources detail the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezm region. The old capital, Bukhara, faced resistance from the ruler but was completely leveled by the Mongols.
Utter destruction. The Mongol forces then crossed the Amu Darya River and attacked Samarkand. The events of that day are said to be etched forever in Uzbek memory. Samarkand was invaded.
Sources describe hundreds of stores piled high with treasures, jewels, antiques just being deliberately destroyed.
And girls and women were enslaved. The Jazjan and Khiva regions were also devastated, razed to the ground. The scale and brutality of Genghis Khan's actions left a clear, horrific mark.
Genghis Khan's brutality in the early 13th century is said to have doomed the human and cultural legacy of Uzbekistan that had developed from the Stone Age right through the Islamic Renaissance.
The period from the mid-13th to early 14th centuries saw this barbarism spread terror across vast parts of Asia and Europe.
Following Genghis Khan's command, cities that had been centers of commerce, trade, and culture for centuries, like Samarkand and Bukhara, were laid to waste practically overnight. Sources describe bloody rivers and the transformation of a glorious era into swollen chaos and wildfire.
Terrible imagery. People fleeing in fear to caves, forests, swamps were captured mercilessly.
Looking at the broader scale, this Mongol conquest, occurring over a century before Tamerlane, resulted in the formation of an immense empire. The invasion and destruction of Transoxiana happened in stages, leaving behind lasting impacts: physical, linguistic, ethnic, cultural, political remnants.
It permanently changed the course of Transoxiana's history and influenced the future of vast eastern territories for centuries, defining the history of the region and those around it.
The Khwarezmian Empire's power peaked just before this devastating storm. It was possibly the greatest conquest in history in terms of its destructive force just pouring into Transoxiana.
Yeah. The Mongols, united under Genghis Khan in 1206, invaded, looted, and devastated lands, turning resisting cities into barren landscapes.
Although initial expeditions before the main invasion were smaller, they had significant implications. The campaign was influenced by geography, politics, economics.
And the Khwarezmian Empire, having absorbed cities like Sogdiana and others, was incredibly wealthy and diverse in resources, making it a target.
So in the wake of the Mongol invasion, the sources detail significant and really disruptive changes. Administration, economics, military structures, all altered.
Right. New provincial structures were set up under military leaders, and traditional titles and hierarchies changed drastically.
Authority in towns often became centered on figures who, under the Khan's will, wielded almost absolute power locally. These town leaders were expected to extract taxes and contributions, often unfairly, and their main official role was just managing public security.
The administrative shifts were complex, and for many people led to increased anarchy and oppression, described as exceeding that of even previous monarchies. A new right for appointing court poets or minstrels emerged, measured in ways described as wider than earlier Muslim administrative laws. An odd detail, but indicative of the changes.
The social and economic impact was severe. Sources mention wealthy groups attempting to provide protection for displaced populations.
But overall, a period described as a dark Middle Age or Great Famine fell upon settlements, particularly impacting agriculture due to the loss of laborers. Traditional agricultural laws and structures were just destroyed.
Over time, native rulers and even some of the conquering Khans underwent processes of adaptation, integration, assimilation.
Yeah, and there were likely new noble orders established by the conquerors, existing in some form.
But despite any initial, perhaps dispersing glory, a long-term negative impact was foreseen in the post-invasion era.
However, the vastness of the territory, both within protected towns and the surrounding steppe lands, offered some space for people to escape the direct, often oppressive rule of some of the de facto Khans.
One source provides a remarkably specific, though sometimes obscurely worded, example of this interference by the conquerors, detailing how the town and provincial capital of Urganch, with its intricate irrigation system, was examined and interfered with.
Right. It mentions specific bastions, graves, descriptions of fields, structural elements. It suggests a very detailed, almost technical look at how the Mongols imposed control on key infrastructure and locations after the conquest.
So the impact wasn't just general destruction, it was a specific disruption and restructuring of essential systems.
Precisely. It wasn't random.
Okay, moving forward again, out of that chaos, the Timurid Empire rose. Founded by Timur, or Tamerlane, in the late 1370s, based in modern Uzbekistan, this empire grew to be vast.
Timur was a powerful figure, Turkic descent, known as one of history's greatest conquerors. Though, as you mentioned, he also earned a reputation for breathtaking brutality.
At its greatest extent, the Timurid Empire stretched from southern Russia all the way to Delhi in India, and Samarkand, in modern Uzbekistan, remained his capital and became a major center of intellectual and cultural life.
Yeah. Timur, whose name Timur Ilang means Timur the Lame, was born near modern Charisabs, son of a tribal chieftain. Details about his early life are somewhat scarce, though.
His rise began around 1360 during a civil war among the Chagatai Khans. Timur skillfully took advantage of the situation, seized control of nearby power centers, built his strength and resources. By the time he launched his first major campaign into Persia in 1382, the Chagatai Khana was essentially under his control, a satellite state.
Sources from the West often focused on his cruelty and ruthlessness, detailing the carnage of his campaigns. Persian chronicles, on the other hand, tended to emphasize his Turco-Mongol heritage.
Yeah, it's noted that trying to understand his concept of justice through his punishments is difficult, and it seemed his power was felt more through the fear and envy it inspired than through traditional forms of oppression.
Interestingly, he framed many of his wars as holy wars, aiming to revive Islam, and was counted among its great kings.
After conquering places like Delhi, he brought artisans and architects back to Samarkand, leading to the construction of splendid buildings and ushering in what's considered a golden age of Persianate culture in the region.
But despite all this splendor, one source provocatively asks whether, in the end, his empire should be considered a success or a failure.
That's a big question. Militarily, he is widely regarded as one of history's most brilliant leaders, combining strategy with immense force and, yes, genocidal ferocity in his campaigns.
A critical point is how Timur integrated Islam into his motivations and the perception of his wars. He presented his slaughters and atrocities as retribution against enemies of Islam. From his perspective, this destruction was consistent with his Muslim faith and worldview.
Seen as a necessary action alongside building infrastructure, promoting Islam, and consolidating his empire.
Exactly. A process of consciously developing civilization through scholars and architecture, often viewed positively within Islamic historical narratives.
While his conquests echoed earlier Mongol movements, they were seemingly intended as a final barrier against future enemies, rather than setting a pattern for others to follow directly.
Yeah, that's reflected in how contemporary Muslim scholars wrote about his conquests, particularly the expansion into the farthest west. They incorporated descriptions of the city's beauty, arts, magnificence into theological reflections on Islam, civilization, and a glorious future.
Following Tamerlane's era, the region's history, particularly the scale of punishment based on religion or tradition, was viewed negatively by some Westerners. International focus remained on Asia, with empires like Turkey and Persia watching Russia's growing presence in Central Asia with concern.
Right, and the outspokenness of figures like the Khan of Kokand highlighted the local focus on more immediate worldly concerns.
After the decline of the Timurids, new powers emerged. Khoja Ubaidullah, who held treasury possessions from Tamerlane's time, fortified Bukhara, and in 1428 refused to pay taxes to a Timurid ruler.
The Bukhara Khans then became powerful, ruling Bukhara, Samarkand, and surrounding areas for about 150 years, establishing mints.
They built important structures like the Gulam and Kalyan mosques, which notably survived multiple destructions, and a court palace. However, sources mention destruction as well. In 1540, the Bukhara Khans used gunpowder to damage the city, and by 1589, its ruins were paved over.
So a complex legacy. This era was also marked by internal conflicts. There were assemblies of tribal groups near Bukhara. Sources recount rivalries and quarrels, including a tragic story where a girl was burned, leading to the Bukharatans retaliating by poisoning rivals.
And after their deaths, the empire broke apart. This period marks the end of a unified world kingdom, as one source puts it, and the beginning of a new era of feudal fragmentation.
Although there were 11 Bukhara Khans mentioned, the Samarkand Khans gained prominence. They defeated rivals and even, symbolically, brought Tamerlane's body back to Bukhara.
Showing a reverence for his legacy, but causing tension with Samarkand.
Exactly. One source uses vivid, almost poetic language to describe Samarkand pocketing Bukhara, highlighting their dominance.
The conflicts continued. Despite being described as pious, the Samarkand Khans faced nervousness and invasions in 1480, but launched successful counter-excursions into Bukhara. Tensions escalated further, with visits to rivals' wives in 1518 and retaliatory burning of cities by the Bukhara Khans, causing a loss of territory.
Right. And a decree forbidding Muslims from collecting money in city mosques led to displaced people being unable to return home. A harsh measure.
In the early 16th century, the Bukhara Khanate consolidated as a new political entity dominating the Bukhara and Samarkand territories. Shahrukh, a nephew of Tamerlane, played a founding role, appointed by a Chagatai Khan to oversee Central Asian possessions. This new Khanate covered a wider area than present-day Bukhara.
Establishing this Khanate was politically smart for the ruling family. It brought valuable irrigated lands, grain, silk, marbles into their control, disrupted Bukhara's direct trade links with China, and helped check the advance of the Shaibanid Khanate from the south.
However, the Shaibanids eventually became the dominant force. Kotokuli built power in bulk against them. In 912, that's the Islamic calendar, Quali Mirza invaded Bukhara, took Samarkand shortly after, and claimed the title of Khan.
This led to settled populations fleeing south to Khorasan, while nomadic groups moved into other areas. After dispersing the population of Bukhara in 916, he set up a system of tribal territories, the Audalis, appointing khans but maintaining overall authority in Transoxiana.
Meanwhile, another major Khanate, the Khiva Khanate, controlled the western part of modern Uzbekistan. It was ruled from 1612 until Russia annexed it in 1873, after which it became an autonomous protectorate under Russian control. Like Bukhara, Khiva was a key center of power in Central Asia during this period.
Yeah, a prominent scholar once said about Khiva, to come to Khiva is necessary once in an eternity. It highlights its long-standing appeal as a unique and historically rich place.
Sources using archaeology and written records trace Khiva's origins back over 2,500 years. It was fortified surprisingly early, around 450–500 AD, with walls and ditches. Its name evolved from Kipos in Greek to Kewaz in Arabic, and finally Khiva in Persian, showing a clear historical lineage. Local names like Shihan, meaning a community of specialized villages, also hint at its early structure.
Right. While the inner city wall dates later, urban life coexists with older origins, perhaps starting from a fortified settlement called Tepekulta, historically known as Zhirkurgan City. It seems the area was likely used for grazing before a city truly developed.
Let's quickly touch upon Samarkand again. Its importance as a historical crossroad on the Silk Road and a major political socioeconomic center is undeniable.
Absolutely. Archaeological work at Afrasiab has been crucial for understanding its urban history since the late 19th century, although a complete picture is still developing. Recent projects emphasize viewing the city as integrated with its surrounding region.
The Samarkand oasis itself, in the Zarafshan Valley floodplain, supported this growth. Its different ecological zones allowed for varied use: fertile plains for farming, river areas for hunting, nearby mountains for summer pastures and resources.
This provided a basis for mutual exchange between farmers and herders in the semi-arid climate.
Returning to that cultural flourishing under the Khanates, the wealth and exchange brought by the earlier empires and the ascendance of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kokand led to a real garnering of cultural capital. Sources mention weaving, painting, carving this heritage from Tamerlane, Persian, Indian, Chinese, Islamic influences into luxurious goods.
Yeah. This period also saw increased agricultural productivity, thanks to irrigation methods inherited from Sogdiana and input from steppe cultures. Descriptions of Tamar's tent guest house highlight the level of luxury: ornate halls, lavish carpets, gilded objects, rich metalwork.
Legends even connect Tamerlane to the oldest Oasis Turkic tribes, like one saying he raised the banners of the Kuva tribe in Samarkand.
And the rulers of Bukhara continued a royal tradition, incorporating pre-Islamic ideas of majesty, with chronicles describing their lives on golden trees made of precious paper and gold leaf.
Architectural styles featured blue glazed tiles, tall forms, carved wooden gates, Painting techniques used plaster and polished clay.
Hidden caches of wealth jewels, gold carpets, textiles were also part of this era, and wealthy townspeople owned extensive collections of textiles and household goods.
Okay, now we move to Russian colonization, which represented a really significant stage for the region between 1867 and 1917, fundamentally transforming the social structure. This process was shaped by historical, political, socioeconomic, and cultural factors.
Yeah, you can look at Russian colonization in three main phases, really. First, the incorporation of the region into the Russian Empire in the mid-19th century, which laid a foundation for modernization. Second, the major socioeconomic changes that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And third, the national movements that began in the early 20th century, partly in response to the oppression and Russification.
In the mid-19th century, the area was largely ruled by the Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand. It was politically fragmented, experienced internal conflicts, had an economy based mainly on agriculture, silk, grain, cotton, and culturally saw declining urbanization and widespread illiteracy.
Right, and these factors played a big role in how Russia was able to systematically incorporate the Khanates between 1867 and 1876.
As a result of the Russian military actions, the Khanates lost significant territory and became Russian protectorates.
During this protectorate period, authority was split between the Russian administration that tied the Khanates to the empire and the local ruling elite.
Starting around 1880, Russia pursued a massive immigrant colonial policy. This brought substantial changes to demographics, agriculture, land use, finance, industry, urbanization, education, culture.
Yeah, this second phase lasted until roughly 1910, ending with World War I and the Russian Revolution.
Russian colonial policy in Central Asia was driven by two main ideas, weren't they? Opening up the territory for Russian settlement and interests.
While simultaneously trying to control or close off certain aspects of life for the indigenous population, a dual approach.
This led to widespread settlement by immigrants, including those arriving from Siberia. Administrative measures were also taken to settle native populations from specific areas and other migrating groups.
And this colonial settlement push involved, in some cases, the destruction of indigenous agricultural settlements.
The agrarian and land systems were reshaped significantly in the late 19th century, altering traditional property structures and how land was used by around 1910.
Let's look at the details of this incorporation using Khiva as an example. In the early 19th century, both Russia and Britain had concerns about the Khiva Khanate, partly due to Turkmen bandits disrupting caravans. The Khanate was often uncooperative. After a coup in 1821, the situation remained unstable. Russia launched military expeditions between 1847 and 1851, even laying siege to Khiva.
But the Khanate resisted effectively enough that Russia initially withdrew its annexation plans.
Yes, initially. However, under a later ruler, the Khanate remained hostile. In a decisive campaign in May 1873, a Russian general led troops on a rapid march to capture the capital. A day-long siege and bombardment on June 11th breached the defenses. Despite resistance, the city was taken on June 12th.
And sources note this was one of the first times artillery was used so effectively in a siege in Central Asia, leading to significant destruction.
Yeah, a technological shift in warfare there. Khiva's annexation was finalized with a new treaty. Russia gained a territory almost twice the size of Denmark from an area that had caused them trouble for decades.
Now, while one source claims this annexation was widely approved, others point to resistance.
Right. Uprisings occurred in 1879 and 1880, which were suppressed. Dissatisfaction among nomadic groups and local discontent spread at Samarkand, reportedly with some involvement from the Khan of Khiva.
An insurrection broke out in Samarkand, and Russian artillery was used against the rebels, causing widespread destruction of city infrastructure and leading to many arrests.
Yeah, this event is remembered in Samarkand as the Slaughter of Pears and became infamous, even leading to a high-ranking official offering his resignation over it.
Moving into the Soviet era, a key moment was the drawing of national borders in early 1924, creating the Uzbek, Karakalpak, Tajik, and Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republics. Instead of uniting Uzbek identity in one state, the process divided Uzbek tribes and populations across Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan.
Exactly. This division separated communities, cut off access to labor and resources, disrupted historical connections, and significantly impacted the homogeneity of the Uzbek population, a major, somewhat artificial restructuring.
Interestingly, shortly after these borders were drawn, accounts like that of Colonel Najmidinov, the People Commissioner of Internal Affairs, were circulated, highlighting Soviet achievements with pride, like the Kamchik Pass Road or new railway stations.
These narratives, despite the persecutions of the early Soviet years, framed the reconstruction of cities and infrastructure as an awakening of the region's history and people, suggesting that Soviet rule was bringing progress and civilization.
By the mid-1930s, the focus shifted. The period of revolutionary fervor gave way to the dominance of the Soviet bureaucracy, the nomenclature. Sources note that until this point, the region's importance had been underestimated, with early economic plans largely ignoring the southern and eastern frontiers.
Right. But within a few years, full-scale industrialization began in Uzbekistan, leveraging its resources. This push to build was a symbol familiar across the Soviet Union. Major cities like Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara were presented as leading examples of socialism, with their historical cores being reconstructed as prerequisites for building a socialist society in Asia.
Following the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, revolutionary changes swept Central Asia. From Moscow's perspective, the region was seen as needing liberation from darkness and requiring the introduction of culture.
A very paternalistic view. Between 1917 and 1920, both national liberation movements and socialist revolutions occurred, with Soviet authority often established through military force. The Soviet regime saw its success in Uzbekistan as crucial for its position in the East. Sources quote, "revolutionaries expressing strong anti-Islam sentiment and advocating for the use of force to establish Soviet dominance." Phrases like "machine gun will nip."
Yeah, pretty stark language. Establishing the Soviet state structure was a priority. In March 1924, the formation of the Uzbek SSR, its borders, government, party structure were approved. A subsequent decree created the Turkestan Soviet Socialist Republic, divided into autonomous republics.
However, this border demarcation process was marked by what sources describe as arbitrary actions. For the benefit of the Tashkent region's leadership, strategic, historical, and economic areas, including agricultural lifelines, were lost to the Kyrgyz SSR.
This also led to significant emigration of Uzbek farm families from certain areas to the Kyrgyz SSR in the 1930s, seeking freedom.
Let's take a moment to look at urbanization and culture through a different lens, drawing from sources that blend historical description with Soviet-era perspective. They note that the 16th century was a peak for urban culture, science, literature, crafts, trade, describing the states that ruled Samarkand, Bukhara, Khojan as written in golden letters.
These accounts portray Uzbekistan as a land of beauty, family, hospitality, craftsmanship. Figures like Alisher Novoy are celebrated as portraying the land as a cultural oasis, a shining pearl. The monuments of Samarkand are presented as testaments to the region's strength and cultural ambition.
Yeah, the narrative emphasizes the people's drive for development, culture, knowledge. Settled in fertile valleys, they excelled in agriculture and animal husbandry, creating renowned crafts like embroidered textiles. Daily life involved legendary efforts in harvesting and maintaining irrigation canals.
Cities built from adobe bricks with grand mosques, madrasas, caravanserais are seen as preserving the memory of skilled masters. Building techniques, like using bricks upright and covering arched spaces in courtyards, are highlighted.
And the legacy of this craftsmanship, like the imprint of the sun in terracotta and metalwork, didn't fade but inspired future generations. This perspective from the sources interestingly weaves together the pride in historical achievements with the aspirations of the Soviet era for building socialism and developing culture.
Now, regarding cultural suppression and national identity under the Soviets, while ethnic nationalism was initially suppressed, it reemerged as a revival of pre-socialist identity. New social networks formed and collective farms became centers for covert resistance, although they didn't initially focus on a national agenda.
Right. Instead, discontent often arose from socioeconomic issues and was directed against local authorities. Religious themes dominated these grievances at first, framing resistance in religious terms.
Informal Islamic groups were often tolerated unless seen as a threat. However, when these groups became more open, particularly with the visible confidence of village women participating, it created a new social dynamic that challenged the authority of the rural elite.
And to reassert control, these rural leaders reframed the social movement in national terms. This led to a significant expression of Uzbek national grievances and the spread of clandestine Uzbek literature.
And the State Security Committee reacted more severely to this nationalist turn, escalating persecution and implementing a deliberate strategy of cultural suppression.
In the 1930s, the Soviet project aimed to graft modern national terminology onto the traditional ethnic structure. Terms for religion, social organization, tribe, clan were introduced, sometimes taught even in basic schools.
The nation-building effort promoted the idea of a modern, literate nation, contrasting it with the traditional, less literate society. However, making literacy mandatory, like for civil service exams, caused distress among ordinary Uzbeks, leading to dissatisfaction and petitions for a new script.
Yeah, the proposed new alphabet was strongly criticized for focusing on the vernacular, seen as a direct challenge to the Soviet narrative and Uzbek nationalism. Its adoption led to public education programs. While literacy in the old script was low, local authorities saw promoting the new script as a duty. This shift, though seen by some as retrogressive, ultimately created a new population base literate in the national vernacular, aligned with the Socialist National Project.
One source makes a specific note that, starting in 1956, the area experienced what is termed a major Afghanization of its ethnic population. We're presenting that phrase just as it appears in the source material, without further interpretation from us.
Understood. Fast forward to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Uzbekistan commemorated its independence and sovereignty 10 years later. Sources highlight the significant effort required to secure and maintain independence in all its forms, noting that it was necessary to suppress those who threatened it. These initial 10 years are seen as a unique and crucial period for the people.
Yeah, there's an emphasis on the importance of understanding this past to evaluate the present.
And while critical of written sources from autocratic regimes, sources note that it's hard to be skeptical about the records of those who fought for independence. The publication of previously classified documents, combined with the reality of the time, is seen as making the achievement of independence transparent and trustworthy.
Gaining independence was celebrated as the realization of ideals. But ideals alone don't establish states, do they?
No, a state relies on its people, citizens, followers. Independence, in a deep sense, must reside in the people themselves, in their blood and heart, as one source puts it.
True, lasting statehood requires control through law, popular sovereignty, harmony, consensus. Not just force or dictatorship. Building a state takes more than just systems and mechanisms. The people are seen as the reflection of the state. Leaders who dedicate their lives to the state are seen as rare but essential.
Looking back at the context of the Soviet Union's collapse, by the early 1980s, the regime was visibly weakening, marked by shortages, corruption, social discontent. People were increasingly questioning the state's ability to provide, despite its claims.
The turmoil escalated after Mikhail Gorbachev initiated perestroika reconstruction in 1986, including glasnost or openness, political liberalization.
Right. This allowed people to voice complaints about the past, discuss repression like the Gulag, publish critical works, reaching a peak where previous self-censorship dissolved.
This initial period of change lasted about 4 years, with a flood of information and public debate. However, it created a paradox. Once complaints were voiced, the state couldn't simply restore the old order.
No. Political liberalization brought high expectations, but also chaos. Partial market reforms led to shortages, long lines, black markets, inflation. Criticism grew into a demand to dismantle the entire system. By the end of 1989, the economic and social order was collapsing.
The reforms also led to centrifugal forces pulling the Union apart. By 1988, parallel power structures emerged. In the Union-level Supreme Soviet by early 1990, nationalist movements gained a majority.
And in Uzbekistan, an opposition group called Berlik formed around the idea of independence, reportedly representing a significant portion of the electorate. Utilizing new laws promoting democracy through elections, these groups gained legislative positions. By March 1990, reforms allowed for the redesign of national curriculums, including history.
December 1st, 1991, saw the first ever nationwide elections for the head of state following these democratic reforms. The referendum on independence held earlier, on March 1st, 1991, is described as showing the maturity of domestic reform processes, a high political culture, and a strong desire for peace and democracy.
Uzbekistan adopted its constitution following a nationwide referendum on June 20, 1999, which sources say was supported by an overwhelming majority of voters, 99.6%.
This constitution is seen as highly significant. First, it indisputably establishes the country's commitment to independence, sovereignty, democracy, the rule of law, human rights.
Second, it defines the structure of the highest state powers. Third, it's considered a solid base for development, reform, democratization. And fourth, it's seen as setting the country's direction for decades, resolving issues caused by rapid changes and legislative backlogs.
In its contemporary state, independent Uzbekistan is described as having secured a remarkable place on the map. Within its ancient lands, like Samarkand, the historical land of Turan, significant steps have been taken towards democratization and liberalization in administration, the economy, spiritual activities.
New structures and organizations have been created, and modern laws and regulations rapidly adopted. Crucially, these changes are seen as impacting the mindsets, worldviews, and behaviors of the people themselves.
To reiterate, Uzbekistan declared independence on August 31st, 1991. On December 29th, the Supreme Soviet officially adopted the Declaration on State Sovereignty and established the country's name.
This marked a new, important historical period, concluding the Perestroika era and ushering in a new system with multiple parties, independent courts, separation of powers.
Like all former Soviet republics, Uzbekistan faced the immense task of breaking away from the highly centralized USSR, building new government structures from scratch, overcoming total dependence, particularly economic.
Developing its own currency, social norms, effective economic management.
These were critical needs.
At independence, Uzbekistan inherited an economy and infrastructure built over decades based on socialist production relations. This system wasn't aligned with the country's resources or potential.
No, it was essentially shut off from the global economy, creating huge problems and incompatibility with market principles. Barriers had been intentionally built against the world market.
Immediately, Uzbekistan had major questions to address: ensuring political and social stability, setting economic and political priorities.
Gradually introducing market fundamentals, establishing relations with other countries, navigating the painful break from the Soviet Union, and gaining international recognition. Sources frame this as the need to use political, economic, military means to accelerate the independence process. Declaring independence quickly and appealing for recognition was seen as a way to invalidate the Union Treaty Agreement and mutual responsibility for security.
Yeah, it's acknowledged that no country acquires independence effortlessly overnight.
Looking at the political landscape today, Uzbekistan is a landlocked Central Asian republic that gained independence in 1991. Sources list its borders with neighbors like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan.
Historically, as we've touched on, the region saw nomadic Turks, Persian-speaking Sogdians, Muslim Arabs, Genghis Khan, Timur, and later Turkic-speaking Uzbeks following further Muslim invasions.
The Uzbek Khanates emerged in the 16th century, experiencing expansion and conflict. By 1868, the Bukhara Khanate came under Russian control, fully annexed by 1920. Other areas became part of the Russian Empire. The 1917 revolution led to upheavals, and the Uzbek SSR was formed within the Soviet structure, with its borders designed partly for economic and strategic reasons to isolate Uzbekistan from its Turkic-speaking neighbors.
Historically, the region played a vital role on the Silk Route. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Termez, Tashkent, Khorazm, Margilan flourished due to this trade. Samarkand and Bukhara became leading centers of Islamic culture, renowned for architecture, libraries, cultural festivals.
Shifting to contemporary economic reforms, sources describe several stages of growth. The government has used protectionist policies like import tariffs and significant export duties, particularly on cotton, gold, energy. These policies aim for growth and stability by managing foreign exchange and credit collection.
There's also been a gradual move towards stimulating market competition, including price liberalization, privatizing state enterprises, removing transport subsidies, which has helped allocate resources better. However, this transition has been difficult, leading to economic strain and varied reactions. Sources suggest a more gradual introduction might have saved social costs.
Though price liberalization was probably inevitable for fostering competition, right?
Likely, yes. Several factors contributed to a significant economic decline in the early and mid-1990s. One was the sudden end of price controls alongside losing access to inputs from the former USSR and goods from the CIS.
Another factor was the severe drop in trade with the former USSR, falling to a fraction, maybe a seventh, of its pre-1991 value, which eliminated key markets and left some countries isolated.
Yeah. Additionally, when exchange rates were allowed to float early in the transition, the sharp decline in world prices for key Uzbek exports like gold and cotton worsened the country's declining terms of trade.
And finally, major industries like energy, machinery, food, textiles saw large output declines because their production processes were inefficient and couldn't easily adapt to world prices.
Interestingly, some sources provide more recent economic data. They suggest that even if investment levels stay the same, capital accumulation alone could contribute about 4% to GDP growth. A significant rise in investment share, say 1%, could push growth to 8% and potentially lead to much higher per capita incomes, over $7,000.
So, barring major disasters, high growth is anticipated, fostering a favorable economic climate and rapid civilizational advances.
That's the expectation. justified by past successes, according to these sources. But they do caution that extrapolating is hazardous. Economics lacks universal certainties.
Still, a new industry has been built from scratch, becoming competitive and exporting about half its products. For example, in 2013, Uzbekistan exported around 100,000 cars, nearly matching Russia's exports.
Transit revenues from shipments crossing Uzbekistan have also increased significantly, even though one source gives a lower population figure, around 7 million.
Compared to the 26 or 32 million elsewhere.
Right. It still notes the emergence of new transport companies and even tourism-related businesses like kayak rentals, suggesting economic diversification. Foreign investments have been considered worthwhile.
And income distribution is described as more even than in most countries, with low crime and no billionaires mentioned. Life expectancy is noted as higher than in countries with similar income levels. Overall, one source paints a picture of a very successful economy.
The key challenge, according to this source, is avoiding dizziness from success, envisaging economic risks, and developing adequate policy to maintain that strong growth rate seen over the past decade, around 8%.
So, to sum up the contemporary situation, Uzbekistan is a landlocked Central Asian country, borders listed, home to an estimated 27-32 million people, primarily ethnic Uzbeks with significant minorities like Russians, Tajiks, Kazakhs, Karkalpaks.
And the issues facing the country today include its government structure, economy, environment, education, religion, media, and cultural heritage.
One source controversially states that Uzbekistan gained independence largely due to its totalitarian politics.
The Constitution grants immense power to the presidency, creating a strong, centralized executive. Islam Karimov, the former Communist Party head, won the initial election, banned opposition, established an autocratic one-party state.
Under this system, opposition and independent media were suppressed, dissenters jailed or exiled. The government has been described as one of the most oppressive globally. Concerns are raised about forced labor in agriculture, particularly cotton, and the arrest of activists.
And the 2005 events in Andijan, where demonstrators protesting abuses were reportedly massacred, though the government claimed they were Islamic terrorists, are highlighted as a stark example.
The economy, in this contemporary context, is described as suffering from these political conditions, facing a lack of investment and corruption. There's a focus on fixed investments, and capital has reportedly fled to Russia, where markets are freer.
However, some positive economic changes are noted, like increasing small-scale activities. But the economy is still heavily influenced by cotton production and the associated labor practices, with the government pushing for monoculture farming.
Delving deeper into human rights concerns, after the USSR's collapse in 1991, Uzbekistan became independent. Brief period under Bukhara capital before Tashkent became Soviet capital. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in '89 caused regional upheaval.
Growing unrest, including farmer protests, led to a police crackdown in March 1990, reportedly killing hundreds. Opposition parties formed, but a fragile peace was broken by protests against the independence referendum in 1991. President Karimov declared independence early without opposition. A brief Islamic revolution, as one source terms it, in late 1992, led to increased restrictions against opposition.
One source details a coup against the chairman of the People's Assembly, resulting in a bloodbath, which the government blamed on Islamists. Growing desperation reportedly fueled a violent campaign by Islamic extremists against the regime. The State Security Committee is noted for securing the defection of a presidential guard platoon.
Right. The Karimov administration turned to India and Russia for assistance. Security capabilities were upgraded, like the Oguz 21st training base in '99, allowing for wider radar coverage. Security cooperation with Russia, Kazakhstan, plus intense spying involving Russian, Israeli, American companies, was used by militia trained by intelligence agencies to beat back the insurgency. Hundreds who fled were reportedly murdered.
By 2000, sources estimate the death toll from this period was around 1,700. Drug users were incarcerated. Islamists were the focus of police surveillance after the 2004 Andijan protests. Future protests across Central Asia, following Kyrgyzstan's 2005 unrest, were met with crackdowns.
Environmental challenges are described as crucial and widespread, specifically focusing on water issues and land degradation desertification.
Uzbekistan is unique in Central Asia for being entirely within the Aral Sea basin. It has water from the Amu Darya and Sirdarya rivers, fed from mountains.
But relies heavily on groundwater for irrigation, using 88% for this purpose. The use of highly mineralized groundwater causes salinization and degradation of the land.
Land degradation and desertification are long-standing, significant problems. In recent years, salinization has affected over 30% of irrigated areas. Severe salinization washed out over 60% of farmland soil crops. Quality deteriorating, fertility rapidly declining.
Foothill and mountain areas also show active degradation, leading to a wide range of secondary land types. Productive soils are sharply decreasing in organic matter and nutritional elements due to salinization, forest erosion, desertification.
Desertification is a widespread phenomenon with much impact on drylands. The population, around 65%, reportedly lives in desertification areas.
The level is determined by environmental change, like climate variability and anthropogenic impact, economic development, resource exploitation. Detrimental change leads to water scarcity, land salinization degradation, biodiversity deterioration.
It's an ecological crisis, really a global issue, affecting adjacent countries through water pollution, dust storms, changing climate, river flow reduction, contributing to the Aral Sea drain.
Looking at global context and future prospects, the collapse of the USSR provoked radical restructurization of society, economy, military, culture. Borders are listed again here.
While Russia dominated other new CIS states, Uzbekistan took a different path, recognizing a potential future threat to its own independence.
All right. In 1993, it was one of the first post-Soviet states to disengage from CIS military political structures. Same year, withdrew from the CSTO, the Russia-fostered military alliance.
Ethnic politics also became more visible after 1991. Uzbeks, as the indigenous majority, reportedly enjoyed priority rights in executive positions, education, language.
The 1992 constitution is seen by some as granting national minority homogenization in bordering provinces. The Uzbek concept of compulsory regional language, potentially targeting reduction of non-Uzbeks, was based on national territorial political independence. Side effects existed.
Uzbekistan also confronted Islamic extremism directly. March 1997, assault on Pashkent subway. December, terrorists struck targets. February 99, militants unsuccessfully attacked Presidential Security Service.
Uzbekistan is described as the first Muslim state in 2 decades to confront Islamic extremism with a well-organized terrorism prevention policy.
One source mentions an asymmetric reply to external terrorism called Sharmangal. Background influences noted are a violent anti-corruption campaign involving the president's son-in-law, the fall of the Taliban's, chaos in Afghanistan, presented as found.
In terms of international alliances, 2001 concluded a 5-year military assistance agreement with the U.S. President Karimov was the first Central Asian leader to ask Western powers for help resisting Islamic extremism after September 11, inviting forces onto territory to combat terrorism in Afghanistan.
Islamic extremism was framed as a political concept, justifying disengaging from CIS empire building, according to some analysis.
Foreign relations details. Decade 91, formally recognized former USSR states. Connections with Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan cemented by visits. From 1995, joined CIS. Cooperation agreements signed. But frustration lingered with bilateral treaties like Tajik-Kyrgyz dam plans affecting downstream water, and on economic integration, ruble zone versus independent economy.
Chose the latter, chasing world economy integration. 1990s fostered relations with China, Kazakhstan. After September 11th, allied with U.S., hosted American bases, increased involvement with NATO multilaterally in Central Asia.
However, a shift occurred. 2003, expelled the Americans. Unequally enforced anti-terror pacts, drew closer to Russia-China.
This sidestepped obligations on democracy, human rights, giving greater scope, counteracting perceived external threats.
That's the interpretation. Placed Uzbekistan on the periphery of Central Asian cooperation. Unclear if this altered long-standing influences.
Barriers to cooperation among Central Asian states are noted. Lack of political culture, interstate identities despite shared experiences, ethnic territorial nationalism and de-Russification stress tensions, regional groupings, small distances from Uzbekistan's sphere, multilateral orgs marginal, alternative partnerships skin.
Independence did open opportunities for cooperation on political economic reforms with international financial institutions. Foreign aid technical assistance helped overcome structural shocks crises, address external imbalances with support, mobilize donor community behind market economy transition, multilateral donors invested in energy transport infrastructure.
National security faced challenges, but was relatively favorable internationally. Successful national security institutions policies followed.
Foreign policy post-independence declared strict neutrality non-alignment. priorities. Cooperation with neighbors, avoid military alliances. Determined by Uzbek interests, equal partnership. Suggested principles, early normalization, independence consolidation, non-interference, constructive dialogue, bilateral relations respecting sovereignty, non-use of force, stressed priority assistance to states in economic collapse, role of international institutions.
Turning to future prospects politically. The years after the first president's passing in 2016 have shown mixed signals. Abandonment of local currency, critique of new freedoms led to concern, post-Karimov instability, or enshrining dark authoritarianism. Deepening state engagements seen as fruitful, parliamentary elections, constitutional amendments slated 2024, seen by some as welcome improvements, especially after Jan 2021 events.
But absence of genuine political opening could just reaffirm the status quo. Hoped external actors promote rights electoral improvements versus functioning militaries. Unwarranted optimism seen in government statements. Failure of pressure seen in demonstrating resilience. International actors stress need for comprehensive political openings, engaging with realities.
Future prospects for human rights reform. 2020 concerns remain. Human rights worries repression might follow forensic improvements. Depends on 1. Who carries out improvements. 2. Degree of top-down grassroots support for continuing remediating reforms.
Results could be continuation of reforming, pragmatism, adaptability, or intensified internal security focus, a brittle frozen regime.
Karimov versus Mirziyoyev regimes. Difference noted is degree of direct questioning of state narrative government authority by public internal elite. Regional protest specter abated by a window mechanism.
Healthy for regime to review dissenting garrison actors, lest inability to monitor respond leads to events slipping through cracks.
Another source describes contemporary Uzbekistan as a unitary state. Admin divisions, government tightly controlled by ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, parliament, council of ministers, judiciary less influential than president.
Shares leading roles in democratic transition, Central Asia, leading role adopting Dushanbe Declaration. Hopes to implement drawing, with some significant population countries, in national legislation, but also notes a regressive amendment to electoral law, rejects multi-opposing parties forming election coalition without ruling party sanction.
This source includes a claim that no human rights violations reported, which starkly contrasts with other sources we've discussed.
Yes, a clear contradiction. It also mentions accusations of government sponsoring extremisms, intensified investigative surveillance versus opposition media.
So, this picture of contemporary Uzbekistan is complex. Sources describe a gradual thaw since late 2016 after Islam Karimov's death. Shavkat Mirziyoyev, chosen successor, introduced reforms after decades worsening authoritarianism.
Elements of previous system dominate, but unprecedented changes. Situation. Beginning to liberalize authoritarian system. With reservations. Most important change. Consolidation demand for reform. Dissatisfaction with rapid socioeconomic changes. Persisting political repressions. Critics, educated citizens support changes reflecting societal needs.
Key elements seen as dismantling might of prospective heir. Ongoing political economic initiative will determine legitimacy, world economy integration.
Limited liberalization must meet urgent socioeconomic reforms simultaneously. Strengthening authoritarianism, return to known ruling rules, pressing socioeconomic problems.
A reflection from September 2016. Political future of key Central Asian country, isolated quarter-century, unprecedented political openness wave. Karimov's death ended era. Power via constitutional succession. Country different.
Mirziyoyev, regarded initially as fortuitous fig leaf for systemic continuity. But signs of political resurgence, demand for reform emerged, simultaneously described as breakdown forcing rapid departure from Karimov's methods. Persistent concerns, departure from authority harm long-term interests more than short-term benefits.
Okay, to bring this deep dive to a close, we've seen that little is known about Uzbekistan's history before Islam arrived, late 7th century AD. Arabs conquered Transoxiana, spread Islam. Afghan tribes drove Arabs from Sirkandaria Valley.
The Samanids ruled until 1005. Ghaznavids retook Transoxiana, mid-11th Khanates formed. 1150 Seljuks conquered, occupied until Genghis Khan's Mongols.
Timur, Tamerlane unifier, founded Timurid dynasty, 1390s. Descendants ruled Transoxiana, Samarkand great capital. Timurids lost power to Uzbek Khanates, late 16th C.
Uzbek Khans, Shiban, Ashtar Khan dynasties ruled Transoxiana 1500-1747, 1740s Pugachev revolt, mid-18th C Khan's Brigade authority, Russians penetrated earlier, Bukhara annexed part of Tajikistan, Central Asia became Russian territory after Tashkent conquest, self-rule eliminated.
1917 Bolshevik Rev allowed brief reconstitution of Khanate. Uzbek Republic, established 1924, absorbed into USSR 1924.
Beginning 1956.
Mm.
That note, again, about major Afghanization of ethnic population, presented as is.
1991 coup in Moscow led to independence from Soviet influence. Country now navigating complex transition in this post-Soviet era, described by one source as ultranationalist.
Today, its population is a true kaleidoscope of ethnic peoples. Majority Turkic Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kyrgyz, others like Shiite Hazars, Jews, Great Siberian Russians.
It's this unique semi-desert region shaped by both climate and human ingenuity over millennia, where an ethnocultural synthesis of peoples from Persian, Mongolian, Siberian ages has joined.
Created one of the richest and most diverse baskets of culture.
Wow, it really is a journey through incredible layers of time. We've gone from the earliest evidence of hominids, ancient civilizations, through the vibrant Silk Road era.
Experienced the profound impacts of empires like the Persians, Mongols, Timurids.
Navigated the complex period of the Khanates, Russian colonization, lived through the Soviet era, and arrived at independence with its challenges and potential today.
That was a lot to cover, but hopefully, by distilling these points from the sources, you've gained a powerful sense of the depth and complexity of history in this region.
Thinking about those layers, the ancient farmers, the merchants on the Silk Road, the scholars in the Islamic Golden Age cities, the resilience shown through invasions and suppression, and the difficult, complex path to becoming the modern state. It's a truly compelling story.
Definitely. So considering Uzbekistan's pivotal strategic location, its deep and sometimes turbulent history, the challenges it faces today, and the signs of gradual reform we discussed, what might the future hold for this land right at the heart of Asia? How will its incredibly deep past continue to shape the journey ahead? Something to think about.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as fascinating and insightful as we did.